So today, bumblebees, I'm going to start right in here by showing a honeybee. And let's see if I can share my screen. We don't need to talk too much about honeybees. Everyone has basically a lot of experience with them automatically by being alive. And we are going to just point out a couple, really all you need to do, because every once in a while you get a very beat up specimen or just a head or something that's extremely goopy. Let's see, I need to go to screen now. Okay, and now we're going to go away from the bureaucracy to the uh, the microscope. Sorry, doing two things at once. I lose all sense of articulation. And what we're looking at is a honeybee. And really all I want you to look at right here are, and I'll phase this in and out, is the very long hairs coming right out of the compound eye. There are a few off the top of my head in the east, I would say only Coelioxys has hairs coming out of their eyes. Other genera, Coelioxys, though, is extremely short. These are very long and very obvious most of the time. In combination with the fact that you have a leg with a corbicula on the hind tibia, so corbicula meaning basically a hollow, open, or hairless area surrounded by hairs used for carrying pollen. In this case, may be referred to other things, but I believe corbicula in bees is almost always some pollen carrying configuration. So I'm thinking here in the east, it's only bumblebees and honeybees that have this corbiculate tibia. When you get down into the southwest, particularly when you get into Mexico and south, you have the stingless bees and elsewhere in the world that also have some version of this. So in the females, I should mention, you almost never see a drone in collection events of honeybees. So the males look an awful lot like the females. They also have long hair. And this tibia section is widened, but not necessarily have the fringe of hairs. It's just basically a big wide area, as is the basatars. It's quite wide too and long in the male species, but or the male gender in honeybees. But really, I've only come across them one. I've only had one specimen that for some reason blundered into a bowl, I think. They're too busy with hanging out in the hive and mating, I suppose. Okay, so that's the honeybee. We're not going to discuss honeybees anymore unless people have questions. I'm going to go now to their fifth cousin, bumblebees. And in the bumblebee world, and I'm going to get this bumblebee ready to look at here. So there we go. You can see in this Bombus pennsylvanicus, there's the corbiculate tibia. In the females, that's a good marker most of the time, but not in the parasitic species, which we'll bring up in a second. But let's go to the bee genera memorization area and scroll this up a little bit. Oops. So I'm going to get that out of the way. So for bumblebees, it's first of all, the vibe of bumblebees is again something very familiar to people. And basically, you have to differentiate them, which we'll get into a little bit, from carpenter bees, or at least the people who are just beginning to start do. In general, except for very worn specimens, you're going to find that the bumblebees have hairs on their abdomen that largely occlude or make invisible the integument, so you can't see through the hairs to the integument below or the skin below. And in carpenter bees, the abdomen is relatively hairless. There's still hairs there, but it's quite shiny and reflective, and you can clearly see the shiny integument on those. And they also don't have the corbiculate hind tibia that the non-parasitic species of bumblebees have. So you're looking at a variety of things. So the corbicula is good, but only for the pollen-carrying ones. If you want to be technical, then the hind wing does not have a jugal lobe, and I believe it is the only genus, at least in the eastern United States and Canada, that has that, and possibly throughout North America and Caribbean. And that is extremely difficult to see. And we'll also see that, for example, Xylocopa, I'll show this too, does have a jugal lobe, but it is really small. And so finding it, because the hairs of the side of the body often hide that, it's flipped over a lot of times. So, a good chunk of the time you can't even see that tiny bit of jugal lobe on the carpenter bee. So your best approach is to become familiar with what carpenter bees and bumblebees look like. I think a lot of you already have that in the bag. You can look at lots of pictures, but hind wing without a jugal lobe is technically the way you tell them apart in the parasitic species. Of course, if you have this corbicula, which we're going to flip now to in a female, then your confidence is really high. So there we are. Here we are, hind leg, corbicula, bare area surrounded by hairs. Want to be a female because of that. The males, as I'll show, have hairs throughout the hind tibia and have no bare shiny area whatsoever. And the shape of that, though, is important in the males. So the other aspect there's a couple aspects that I want to talk about in bumblebees that people struggle with and have to deal with. So in Bombus, and the first one is malar space. And the malar space I will define, and Joan, perhaps, if she's willing. Does she mention anything, Claire?
We have not seen anything in the chat from Joan.
Okay. I'll pause at some point, and if she wants to jump in, that would be great. Otherwise, I will stumble through the technical aspects myself.
Everyone should have the ability to unmute.
Yeah. And later, when we get into bumblebees at the species level, we'll come back to this because it's important to discuss because some species identifications hinge on the malar space. So,
question.
Yeah.
How can I differentiate the drones?
Well, you mean differentiate whether it's a drone or not a drone?
Mm.
So
would the asker like to elaborate on their question?
I will say, though, prophylactically, that the drones are males, so they are going to have the male characteristics such as seven abdominal segments and 13 antennal segments. So you'll be able to count them and tell it's a male. It's really more to point out that the males are super uncommon in terms of finding them during a normal ecological or inventory survey, and that they look very much like the females in terms of hair being present on the eyeballs, and the corbicula is not present, but you can see the ghost, I would call, of a widened hind tibia, and the vibe is definitely honeybee. So, but it being a drone is just a fancy honeybee-centric name for a male honeybee, Apis mellifera. Okay, so to orient yourself here, and the malar space is something I think we talked about very early on. It's used in a variety of different genera. It's very important in bumblebees, and what that amounts to is the space between the base of the eye and the base of the mandible. So orientation, the mandible is running this way, That's the mandible off that direction. We're looking basically upside down between that eye. And the length between the apex of the eye and the nearest distance to the mandible is the length. And then you're comparing it to the width of the mandible, which is where we all get in trouble. So let me zoom in a little bit more. And if Joan is there, she can take over at this point. Joan, are you there? Maybe not. I'm going to show a short Mallar space thing too, so you get that difference. One qualitative way that this presents is that if it's got a long Mallar space, it's got a longer face in general. So Bombus pennsylvanicus, Bombus fervidus, and a number of other bees, like Bombus vagans, they have a long-faced vibe, though people don't measure the head width as part of the characters. Maybe they should. And species such as, Rufocinctus, what are some of the others? Turnarius. Impatiens have a short, Aphanus are very short-faced, and they look more rounded, like the head is round. In any case, what the things to think about is what is the width of the mandible? Okay, so the mandible has things like this is probably the muscle attachment. And these are condyles. So condyles on either end are basically like the hinge points. And the muscle is slightly off center so that, I guess sort of like some door mechanisms. When that muscle contracts, the mandible flips open. So Jones' paper with Denny and others recently defined this very precisely, so it's worth looking at because it turns out that a lot of what we have done in guides in the field and including in past keys is sort of casually look at something like this distance versus that, and in your mind, rolling that together and not actually measuring it. It turns out that at a species level, actually precisely measuring this distance, so you have to figure out what are the actual ends and then measuring this distance, which is easier, gives you some really precise information about what species you're looking at. So I'm not going to.
What are you looking at so I can write it in my screenshot?
Bombus pennsylvanicus.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to pull this specimen now, and I'm going to, well, actually, before I go on, I'm going to, because I'll forget otherwise. We're going to jump to.
Is Denny on?
I didn't see him either, but Denny would be good too.
Yeah, I don't see him.
Yeah. It's maybe we'll just wait for that, and I'll try and get them to explicitly be there for our discussion of technical Mallar spacedness. Another feature that's often used in identification of bumblebees is the level at which the ocelli, the lateral ocelli, are in relationship to the compound eyes. So for most species, Bombus pennsylvanicus being one that in the worker is the case, but in the queen is not the case. If you take a line and snap it between the tops of the compound eyes, the ocelli.
Joan's here.
Okay.
Do you want to unmute anything? Yeah.
Well, let me get a short Mallar space thing in a second up, and then Joan can jump in and talk about that one when we have actually a Mallar space to look at, and I can try and point out what she's talking about. Okay, so here I'm just pointing out the relationship of ocelli to the tops of the eyes. This line, they all are basically on or touching that line. And I'll show you a different species, Bombus cruciaculus, where the ocelli are recessed down, and that's a good identification tool. So you can see what people are talking about when they talk about recessed ocelli. It's the line between the tops of the compound eyes is the measurement line and the relationship of the ocelli to that line. comes up with the character. Okay, let me go back now, and we're going to pull up a Bombus ternarius specimen, and I'll get its malar space in view, and then I'm going to turn things over to Joan, if that's okay. Is that sounding like it's okay?
According to her chat.
Okay, let me get a picture up first, and then I can be Joan's pointer.
Joan should have the ability to unmic and show your camera if those are things that you are inclined to do.
Right. All right, let's see.
What specimen do you have right now?
This is Bombus ternarius. And can't really see the malar space. The leg on that side is in the way. I had pulled these because they were visible. So hopefully this side is the visible side for malar space hidness. And it is visible, but let me zoom in here and see if we can up the visibility. It is dark. All right, so I think I'm pretty good here. There's some dirt on these spots. So, Joan, do you want to talk about, this is ternarius, it's short, and maybe I'll zoom in as much as I can, and you can talk a little bit about what you've found in terms of measuring and precision and all that for a couple minutes. Joan? Did Joan unmute?
Joan has not unmuted, and I am not able to unmute herself for herself.
Okay.
I don't know how to get voice.
Oh, there we go. All right.
Hi.
Yeah, sorry for putting you on the spot, Joan. But I thought, oh my gosh, that's right. The Queen of Malar Spaces is going to be on today, or could be on. So, or the King, but it's the Queen.
I'm the queen bee. I'm happy to, but this is a neat project in that it was a team of people. It's what you get when you get bee people, statisticians, geneticists all together. We were able to unravel a problem with some cryptic species in Bombus vagans and sandersoni. So that was Denny Johnson, Jeremy, and so on. So one of the things that we found, and with Denny's very careful measurements on an awesome scope, we were able to use the measurements that have shown up historically in bumblebee guides and papers that have been published. So looking at the malar length and cheek space turned out not to be absolutely new, but we have the measurements that worked out. And so one of them was to go from the very bottom of the eye, Sam, if you've got your cursor there.
So right, I'll focus.
The rim of the eye. Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about, are you talking, okay, hang on, let me get some focus going here. So I'll move this away. So there's the eye, and then there's this little space that I would call a rim. So are you talking about the eye edge or the rim edge?
So it's if we actually poked the eye out of the cheek. And so it's going to be that bottom rim edge.
Okay. So if people can, maybe I'll play with the lighting here a little bit, but and this is true of all bees, and that's what I'm glad you said that, because that's what I've been going on too, is you have the rounded where the ommatidia are of the compound eye, and then there's this little spacer smooth area, which again, I call it the rim, and it sounds like Joan calls it the rim.
Mm-hmm.
Call it there might be word of carina in the guide.
I don't think, well, carina would be a raised line. I don't think of it as a raised line.
In our paper, which is was published in the journal Insects, it's an open access paper. Anyone can get it, and there are some really high definition images in that paper.
Yeah, which these are not.
But they're pretty good.
Okay. All right. So we have, so basically in this picture, we would talk about running from the apex, right? So right about there, is that
Mhm.
where you would position it for a measurement?
Yeah, and then to the shortest distance on the edge of that cheek where the mandible is going to attach.
So that would probably be there. We may have a difficult time here because of the poor quality, but something like that right there, would you say?
Well, it looks like it would be a little to the left in what I saw. And this, it can take practice. You can use an insect pin and run it along the edge of the cheek where the mandible will attach. And by
Yeah.
using the tip of an insect pin, you know exactly where the cheek ends.
Right. So this, again, we have this bad image quality, is I would take this to be the edge of the cheek area,
Good.
but maybe not. Something
Yes,
like okay.
agreed. Mm-hmm. And then about midway along that edge, you're going to find this shortest distance
Yeah.
from the eye to that cheek. And then you'll place your reticle and make that measurement for the length.
Explain reticle.
Okay, a reticle is a small measuring device that can go into the eyepiece of a microscope. And it has superfine divisions. And again, this in the paper, there are step-by-step directions on exactly how to do this. How to mount the bee so that it's flat and that you're not going to have any distortion of the different measurement lengths, and encouragement to measure everything twice or thrice just to make sure that you have what you want. So that length using the reticle, which is in what I use is in the eyepiece. For those with a very steady hand, BioQuip has a handheld measuring device that could be used. We didn't do that for this, and it would really have to take a surgeon's hand. The next measurement was from the rim of the cheek.
Okay, so when you say the rim, are you talking about
The
particular place on it, or?
Yeah, I'm wondering if I can.
I'm not
Can I
sure.
send a picture to Claire?
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
How
Yeah.
can I do that?
You can send it to me in an email, and I can then share the screen that way.
Okay, I'm going to do that right now.
All right, that's probably going to be way better than trying to deal with this fuzzy picture thing.
All
Okay.
right, so I'm getting this to Claire. Well, will Sam cover something else?
All right, I will. Okay, I'm going to go and show, we'll come back to this. I'm going to show a recessed eye in I got to put this in the right box. There it is. Recessed eye in Bombus cruciaculus, where you can see it's, so these are also, everything in bees is, often subtle, but if we go here, dial that down, looking at the top of the head again. Okay. And
So while you're focusing,
uh-huh.
question about Bombus species level IDs. Don't we get a lot of clues from hair color and geography? How often would we have to delve into Mallar space?
So yes, so a lot of things split out into large groups, and then you're stuck with some species pairs. So Joan mentioned Sanderson and I, and was it Vegans? Yeah, Sanderson and I and Vegans, and that basically you're stuck despite trying to look for other features. You're basically stuck with a measurement of Mallar space to differentiate those two. So it happens. And also so the places where you need to measure are where the differences are subtle. So you saw a short and a long malar space. You can eyeball those, right? Those are not a problem. It's when you have two very similar species that have slightly different, we might say roughly equal to a bit longer, or it's actually, and it comes down to some minute measurement ratio differences that you have to get into measuring, or you have to call them, which is fine, a species complex. Fagan/Sanderson is a totally legit category to end your survey with there. So a lot of times you don't need to do the malar space thing. It comes up throughout the bee world in a number of different kind of contexts, though. So it will haunt you. So here, apex, we're just doing this recess thing. So here is the apex of the compound eyes on the top of the head. And you can see that there's, if we have this imaginary line across those two, that the ocelli are clearly below that, but not by a whole lot. So it's less than 1 ocelli diameter, but that is very useful as part of the identification string for Bombus cruciaculus. So one of the good things about Discover Life keys and about a lot of experiences, sometimes you get really crappy specimens. They're not all pristine. And so sometimes one of your favorite characters may be gone because the specimen is broken, or difficult to see because there's glue, or it's goopy, or the hairs are worn off, all kinds of things. And you still can ID them based on other subsets of information. So right now, we are just talking about some very basic identification generalities for things that trip people up with bumblebees. And I'm going, yeah.
I'm
Are we ready?
Share the picture.
Go right
also,
ahead.
Were you just showing Cruciaculus
Yeah.
or Turnarius?
That was Cruciaculus.
Okay. Want to know for the screenshot.
Okay. I'm gonna.
Taking control and.
Do I need to turn off to uncontrol?
I'm just trying to find where the picture went. All right. You guys should see Joan's picture up on the screen. It looks like it.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Oh, yeah, good.
If you would like to unmute or explain, but I will also send out this picture and your paper in the email and put it on the Teams. But if you just want to talk us through this real quick.
Can people see my cursor? Because I could help point at things, but maybe you can't see it right now.
I think they'll be able to see my cursor.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right.
Large, so that's just going to be how it is for the moment.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm back here, and then photo credits certainly go to Denny Johnson here. He did an amazing job. So you can see in A is the what we used for the malar length, where from the very rim of the eye. And then as you look down to where the malar width is measured, and again, in the paper, you can blow this up so you can really see. But if you have a straight line going across the bottom to measure that width, you'll see that there's that small little arc in the middle where the shortest measurement is taken. Also in that picture, you can see that underneath the microscope light, there's a little bit of glare. And if you've got a gunky specimen or just can't quite get the light right, you can use the very tip of an insect pin, rub it along the base there, and you'll know exactly where you're going to take your end measurement on that.
Okay.
And then in picture B, with the mandible removed, it can be tricky. If that mandible is open, it gives the impression that the malar length is longer than it is. So don't be deceived. If you've got a Sandersoni and that mandible's out, it might look longer than it is. So that's where these measurements come in handy.
And how would you would that insect pin trick work, particularly if it's open? like the mandibles are open, or are they kind of too flush? Like, what's your trick then?
It will work. You can rub the insect pin along the edge of the cheek, open or closed.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So on the mandible width, could you just go over where your measurement points are on the mandible?
Yes, so in picture B, you can see there's the cheek condyle on the left, and you would place your reticle on that end, and then you're going to run to the length, to the right, to the other edge of the cheek, and you'll put your reticle there. Again, measure it once, twice. Given the lighting, how you're reading it, it's really good I just keep a piece of paper and I have a W and an L, and I make my measurements a couple, 3 times.
Mm-hmm. And
you could also, if you do have that mandible wide open, you can just measure the length of the mandible itself, where you can see the acetabulum socket in C going down to the condyle. So you can measure those. And if you practice with that, it gives you a sense of the when the mandible's closed, where exactly you're going to be making those measurements. It's a ball and socket sort of arrangement where the mandibles need to be able to open and close in there. And so it's kind of fun, actually, just to be able to do the measuring, look at the mandible versus the cheek, and as you do those different measurements, you really get a sense of where you're putting your reticle and making those measurements. Now, one other thing we found over time was that the people who had gone before us had then compared the malar length to flagellar segments. They said 1 through 5. So we decided to go with 1 and 3. We weren't sure if they were using the scape and the base. So using F1 and 3. And this also turned out to be a good way to make the measurements to be able to tell these cryptic species apart. Sometimes you'll find your measurements are on the cusp and you just want a second way to go. So by measuring flagellar segment 1, and if you were to blow this up, you'd see that at the very base, Claire or Sam, if you can put, yes, there's a little shiny spot there. And so the edge of the reticle goes where the texture on that segment begins. It's a very crisp line. And then we measured to the right to the end of that segment. And then again for number 3. So you've got lots of options to go here. So if you've got a bumblebee specimen where the hair just didn't fluff up, so you can't use that as even a clue. You've got a bee with a leg or an antenna bent over the edge of the cheek, then you can then do the best you can. Well, do what you can, measure it very carefully to get the length. And then you can use those flagellar lengths where you divide the length of the bumblebee's cheek by the flagellar segment to get a ratio for segment 1, and then do that again for segment 3, and you'll get another ratio. And then those are presented in the paper as well. So that gives you 3 things to go on: the malar length to width, the malar length to flagellar segment 1, and the cheek length to flagellar segment 3. So if you get something that just isn't quite lining up, then you've got 3 options and you have to make your best educated guess. Again, some specimens won't have antenna at all. They've been snapped off. So lots of ways to work here. The other tricky species that came in here in this, they call it the 2-stripe complex, was some of these Bombus perplexus. There's an uncommon state where the hair on the side of perplexus, where it's usually black, it can be all blonde. And so we went ahead and made the measurements for the all blonde perplexus as well, and those are presented in the paper. That's that. Any questions?
I have a question, and then I can't see the chat, so I'll bop over the chat in a second. But when we're looking at the Glandular segments. Are we looking at their shortest edges too, or not? Just to clarify, we're not going along their sometimes longer edge when they're curved.
That's correct. The decision was made to go with that shortest distance as illustrated in that image number with the letter D.
Okay, let me toggle over to the chat to see if we're missing anything.
Thank you, Joan.
Yes,
And
yes,
thanks
thank
for
you.
all this work.
Thanks.
I'm going to get a specimen ready here.
We don't have any questions. Is that incorrect? Do we actually have questions and you just haven't written them yet because Joan was doing such a fabulous job explaining?
Because we're moving to leg things here right now. So
On to leg. Triple confirm that the last Bombus you showed was Brachiopolis, right?
for me, yes. And
Uh,
now I'll be showing Bombus citrinus.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing so that Sam can share again. And
Okay.
another big round of applause for Joan. That was just so helpful.
Oh,
And
did you share me, or do I need to do anything?
You now have the ability to share.
Okay.
And again, all of that stuff will go up onto the teams, and that is definitely a resource I will be sending out in the email. We are so lucky to have such talented, wise people in our community.
Who clearly know how to have fun. I'm not sure anyone else except this group here would label that as fun, Joan, but I'm going to go with it as I have fun with that too. Okay, so are we ready? Can you see my screen?
No, we cannot see your screen.
Oh, did I not share? Oh, I see. Okay, how about now?
We can see your screen.
Okay, so we're looking at Bombus citrinus now. So Bombus citrinus is one of the most common eastern parasitic bees. And so formerly these were in a different genus, but now they're back in Bombus. And they are told apart in the females pretty readily by the fact that they have no corbicula. So here's again, the hind tibia and basotarsus, and you can see that there's no shiny area. I mean, and there's hairs throughout, and it's rounded over. It looks like a male's leg in a lot of ways. So that makes the parasitic members easy to ID. There may be a little bit of confusion because, first of all, these are uncommon, so you don't run into them. So it might throw you for a loop when you look back here, knowing that it's a female and a bee, but seeing that there's no corbicula. But you have to remember that there are these parasitic members. If you want confirmation, you can go in there and try to explore the hind wing and see that there is nothing but a little tuft of hairs back there. It's very difficult, but I think the rest of the vibe is very bumblebee-like, so you should get that. I'll show, because it's in this picture here, the terminalia area is full of good characters in the females of the parasitic species. I'm presuming that this has something to do with the takeover of the nest, but this area, which I am showing partially here, maybe I can turn it a little bit, looks very different from the other queen bumblebee species. And there's some good characters which at the species level work out pretty well. So that's also wow, that did not do anything for us. That is something that will also show up. Okay, so there's a terminalia. And now I'm going to show perhaps the most tricky one are the male parasitic species. And they're tricky because while you know they're a male, what happened to my identification tags on that? I'm not sure. While you know that they're a male, it's a similar group now to the other males because none of the males have a malar space or a corbicula on their rear hind tibia. So, and there's not a lot of other characters separating them out that I find people have an easy time using. So what we're looking at here are in the males is if we were to go to a non-parasitic species, the shape of the hind tibia is quite different. It's a little bit difficult to see 3 dimensions here, but what you're seeing in the parasitic species is basically a hind tibia that is mounded over on the face that faces outward, so that the apex, the highest part, is running basically down the midline. And in the pollen carrying species, the highest aspect to the hind tibia, in other words, the widest, fattest portion, is along this edge that would be, if this were stretched out, would be facing forward. So this is more tubular in parasitic species, and it's more off-center in terms of the cross dimensions of the hind tibia. Not a great character. And I should point out that the Fervidus / Pennsylvanicus males, which are actually problematic to tell apart from each other, have a very parasitic species hind tibia aspect too. So in cross section, their greatest thickness is along the center line too. So that's what we're talking about. We do have a way to separate out Pennsylvanicus and Fervidus from the parasitic species. I can't recall the details right at the moment, but we're really not talking about species today, but just to point out what's going on with the parasitic members in terms of the characters that are used the most often for the hind tibia. But I will also show that the head, and this is something that probably has been quantified somewhere, but I haven't had information, or we can incorporate it into the guide. But in parasitic species, they have a very a aspect to the vertex. So the vertex is the measurement between the back of the head and the lateral ocelli, or the ocelli group here. It's very wide. So there's probably been a measurement, but I don't know what it is. But when you look at them, it's like, oh, if you have a visual on that, it's like that's almost certainly a parasitic species in the males. And then, pardon? This is Bombus citrinus. It's the most common. I think it's mostly associated with Bombus impatiens in terms of a nest invader. It's almost undoubtedly involved with several other species too. So that takes care of the bumblebee basics.
Before we wanted to return to the terminalia.
Yeah.
I wasn't really sure what you were showing.
All right, let me see if I can find another specimen, a slightly different one. I can't give you a definition here. It's similar to the back of the head. It's not something that's quantified, but the terminalia on the females in the parasitic species tends to be fatter, let's call it, and curved around. So here we are looking at a different specimen, a different female Bombus citrinus. The sting is not protruding, but this area here is a lot longer than in queen bumblebees, so queen pollen-carrying bumblebees. And there's thicknesses in here, and there's different aspects that among the different species of parasitic bumblebees are useful and sometimes required to separate out the species. So let me get one more specimen.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to get a different specimen. I didn't like that one very much. Just grabbing them out of the box now. Let's try this one. Additionally, a lot of these parasitic species also have hair characters so you don't even need to know necessarily anything to use some of these other characters. So right now, we've got another female. Can't quite see. How about like this? Yeah, these are all not showing really well. This raised, thickened section of the specimen. Let me do it from the side where the legs get in the way here. I don't think I'm doing it justice, but when you start looking at them, you're going to see in this last abdominal segment a wide variety. Some have nail-like protrusions that come down that are associated with the sting, and if the sting's out, it's often curved, looks very wicked. You can see some idea that there's these thickened areas and hollows. There's a lot of architecture. The citrinus is one of the least architecturally complex ones, but it does have that. It is thickened, so it's just another way of thinking about the what's the portrait of the Bombus citrinus. So here we were looking at a female. This is still the female here. Let me get the things going here. Again, this long back head is presented. This one has a very short malar space, as you can see here. So it's very rounded faced looking, but it also has this big back head, which is a hint that it could be a parasitic species. Because we're running out of time, we'll just jump onto carpenter bees as a contrast, because particularly if you're doing visual things, which we're doing more of now for surveying, you need to separate them. I think a lot of you already know about separating them in general. There's a couple technical things, really only one that I can think of, and I think is in the genera memorization Excel spreadsheet. So here we have the very different aspect of the abdomen, which is very little hair, shiny, usually sparsely pitted compared to bumblebees. Bumblebees have lots of pits usually, but you don't see that because the hairs are in the way. So there are small amounts of hair, particularly you'll see hair on T1 on this edge. So this can look like, oh, I have Bombus impatiens because that's this is dark and this is T1 is light, but there is almost no hair in the rest of the segment, particularly in these middle tergites. So that gives you the clue. Technically, let's see if we can find this. It does have a jugal lobe, but it's very small. So here's the hind wing hiding under, in this on the right hand side, hiding under the forewing. This is the vannal lobe, very long, as it almost always is. Now I had this specimen out because you could theoretically see the very tiny and difficult to detect usually jugal lobe, which tells you that it is indeed a carpenter bee, not a bumblebee, because it has a jugal lobe. But this is one of the reasons. So this is the vannal lobe, a little bit crisped up, and the jugal lobe is right here, but folded under and apparently invisible because of the lighting. But if we turn it a little bit, so you can see, this is it right there. It's associated and would conform to this under a lot of circumstances, but this happens all the time with these hind wing architecture. It flips over and folds back underneath and appears to be gone, or it just makes it irritatingly difficult to ID. Let me just run this underneath. And there's usually as this specimen, I'm just looking at this and see if there's a way to get in there. How about that direction? See the members. They also have very non-hairy faces. The faces are very flat. This one has no face because the head is gone. And I think we can see the folded over jugal lobe now. And this is one reason I almost never use these. So here is the jugal lobe. This is the base of the wing. This is the jugal lobe right there. It's folded at right angles to the plane of the rest of the wing. So the ventral lobe is running. We're looking at it from the side or underneath. The ventral lobe is running way out there somehow. So there's the jugal lobe. We couldn't even really see it from the other direction. We're basically out of time, so I'm going to stop there.
We're gonna ask, we want to belabor the point. Do the Mallar's face characters work well in queens and workers?
Yes.
Both.
Yes, and they can be slightly different. And I believe that Jones' paper lists things out by worker and by queen. However, in general, if workers have short malar spaces, the queens also have short malar spaces. Bombus perplexus, Joan, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe might be an exception to that, where there's a bigger shift in the malar space between worker and queen. And the same general patterns happen in males, a little bit more difficult to tell. So I'm just showing in these last minutes the face, very dirty face of the carpenter bee. You can see how flat it is, how visible the integument is on the face of that specimen. And the look is very different. And the malar space is minute in carpenter bees.
Oh, good point. I would add that Xylocopa has a very long and narrow marginal cell.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, I totally forgot about that one. Let's look at that. That is a good character. It's at least 7 times as long
Wow.
as it is wide. And gosh, I don't know if I even put that in the memory. Well, I might. I didn't look it up. Okay.
I don't know if it's in your cheat sheet, but in Discover Life.
Yeah.
What about the color of the wings for Xylocopa? Is it a good character?
Color of wings are a good character for species differentiation, because of a lot of variability among species. I can't be definitive, but often if you see something that has a dark violet and with a lot of overtones of other colors, that's often a Xylocopa. Okay, so here is the really, really, really long. Let me see if I can get some lighting differences in there, some contrast. The really long, here's the width of the marginal cell, and here is the length of the marginal cell. And I'm a little bit fuzzy as to what's going on down here, but it's really long and narrow in that group. So that's another good character. I should have actually looked that up beforehand, but I did not.
Bombus wings, dark iridescent. Xylocopa wings, dark iridescent. Bombus wings, more brown clear.
Yes. In looking at bumblebee species, particularly in the field, we often classify the dark-winged bumblebees, which are in the east would be things like Oricomus, Fervidus, and Pennsylvanicus, and what's the southern bumblebees name escapes me at the moment. All have really, really black wings, which are really not black, but dark brown. But they don't, as far as I know, none of them anywhere in the world have iridescent patterns to them.
Perplexus, question mark?
Perplexus is whether it's a dark winged or not.
I think they were wondering if that was the southern one you couldn't.
Oh no, yeah, it's I don't see it. I've only seen a few, but I can't remember what it is. Very short Miller space though.
Oh, okay. We've reached about our hour, considering we started a couple minutes late, running a little over 2. Any final questions, comments, concerns? Not seeing any immediately. I'm going to remind everybody next week it's going to be at 4:30 Eastern Standard Time. I'm going to send out an email pretty much immediately today because we have a lot of resources going out and I cannot be trusted to remember them next week in the, like, don't forget about class email, which I will also send because it'll be at 4:30. So look out for that by the end of the day. Going to have Joan's picture, Joan's paper, some of the Bumblebee PDFs I mentioned in the chat. Rich, more on Xylocopa next week, question mark?
I wasn't planning on it. I was planning to get into, I think, the eucerines and maybe just the eucerines, but maybe also contrasting it with Anthoptera group, which all of those can look Bumblebee-ish.
Mm-hmm. But Rich, if you have any specific questions, totally feel free to email and can address them. All right, I'm going to turn off the recording and everybody have a great day.